Hello, welcome to my latest photography tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at bracketing of exposures, and that is the idea that you're setting the camera up so it takes the same photograph but you're making a mid exposure and then an exposure that's darker, maybe an exposure that's even darker still, and then an exposure that's lighter than the middle exposure, and then an exposure that's even lighter still. And that's useful for a few different reasons. One is sometimes you're in a situation, maybe it's too bright to take a good reading on your screen, you're a little bit unsure of the lighting. If you bracket a few exposures, you know that one of them is going to be right. You know that when you're back at your computer and you're looking at your images, one's going to be spot on. So it's like a safety net. You know you've got a good exposure there. But then another thing, which I want to look at in a little bit more detail, and we're going to focus on at the end, is the idea that you can use a range of exposures, but you can blend them in Photoshop. So different exposures obviously capture different amounts of detail. If it's a very dark exposure, the bright areas might be full of detail. It's a very light exposure, the shadow areas might have lots of detail. So by doing a range of exposures, you can then use Photoshop to pull out the detail you want. And I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to do a little demo within Photoshop, which should hopefully be useful. So just as I start all tutorials, I show a few examples of images that sort of demonstrate why these techniques are useful. So here's one from the Brecon Beacons of a cottage we were staying in, and I used bracketing here. I had the camera on a tripod and I took the photograph, but for the moonlight to be lighting the landscape, it took a much different exposure for me to be showing the cottage, particularly the detail in the cottage. You can see detail in the windows. So I would have done a much longer exposure to soak up tons of light for that landscape, the snow, and then a much quicker exposure to soak up not that much light at all for closer to the cottage, and then even quicker still through the window, and then even quicker still so you can see the curtains in the window. So by having a range of exposures, I can play with the detail and bring out the detail I want to kind of create the atmosphere I want and create that lovely glow from the cottage and that kind of welcoming warmth. That's all to do with bracketing and using a range of exposures to create that image. Here's another one where it's useful. This is inside a cave, so there's an awful lot of difference in exposure between the view you're seeing outside the cave there, the tree, the snow, the daylit landscape, and then the exposure of the light as you get into the cave, as you get deeper and deeper into the cave, and then as you get the stones right at the back of the cave. That's basically getting such a small amount of light that's just reflecting off the snow and coming through the aperture of the cave. So it's a tiny bit of light. So by using much longer exposures compared to the photograph I took of the snow outside, I'm able to capture detail on the inside. So I'm able to bring out that detail of the rocks. And in this image, you've probably got about 4 bands of exposure. You've got the outside, which would have maybe been a 60th of a second. Then you're coming into the cave, you've got half a second. You're coming deeper into the cave, you've got a second exposure. And probably to get some detail in those rocks at the background, we're talking about maybe 4 or 5 second exposure. But then through careful use of Photoshop, I can blend those different images together and bring out the detail I want. Now we're moving on to a landscape. This was one of the first images where I really tried this technique. The entire sky is a much darker exposure than the ground, and by using that darker exposure, I'm able to really bring out the detail and the texture in the sky. If I'd exposed it all the same, the sky would have been quite burnt out and not had detail in the clouds near the sun. And then I think I even used a much darker still photograph of the area right close to the sun. So I've got detail of the clouds as they're almost touching the sun, which you just wouldn't get with any camera. They just wouldn't pick up that range of detail. So by bracketing and by then blending those exposures in Photoshop, I can get that huge range of detail there. And here's the last example. Similar to the first cave one I showed, I would have used different exposures for the area just left and right of the column to get that lovely detail there. But then the detail that would have fallen on the rocks as you get further into the cave would have been a lot more subtle, a lot more slight. So by using much longer exposures for the detail far to the left of the column and far to the right and the roof and even the back of the column, I was able to pick out and show details of the rock. For example, the back of the column was barely getting any direct light at all. So by really creating a long exposure of that part of the picture, I could create a little bit of shape in there. Not much, like I don't want to feel like I'm telling lies with this technique. I want to try and show how it felt to be there. Because when you're in the landscape or in a cave, your eyes are permanently adjusting as you look around. They adjust to take in more light, to take in less light. They might get dazzled for a second and they'll adjust to that brightness. So I want to kind of mimic that in my photographs. So I blend images to kind of capture that idea of as your eyes pan around a scene, they capture details in different ways because the the irises of your eyes are constantly adjusting and changing, and your sensitivity of your eyes are changing as well. So I want to try and mimic that in my photographs, and by bracketing and blending, I'm able to capture the detail that's maybe close to how it felt to look at that view, but you don't quite capture it in photographs. But by blending I can mimic how it was looking at that view. So we're going to crack on with the demo now and explain a bit more about it, and then at the end there's going to be some stuff on Photoshop and how to put these exposures together and how to blend them in Photoshop. In this one we're going to be looking at bracketing. That's the idea that you keep the camera in a fixed position and you do a number of exposures using the shutter speed to make them lighter or darker. So you have your middle exposure, and then you use a slower exposure which makes it lighter, and maybe even another slower exposure which makes it even lighter still. And then you go the other way, you do a quicker exposure which makes it darker, and an even quicker exposure and it makes it darker still, and you get a range of exposures of the same view. And there's two benefits of that, or two ways you can use that. There's the idea that sometimes you can be unsure about what the best exposure is, but if you take 5 at different settings, at different shutter speeds, there'll be one that really works well, that works the best, captures the detail in the nicest way. There's another way of using it, which is if you then take those 5 exposures and bring them into Photoshop and stick them on top of each other as separate layers, you can then use layer masks to bring through detail of certain images. So you could, if the sky's too bright, you could use a darker exposure and paint a bit of that detail through using layer masks. Or if the shadows are too deep, you can use a brighter exposure and bring some detail through there. So all about pulling out different bits of exposure and bringing them together, and that's what can start to create a really sort of painterly feeling landscape. So we're going to head to these woods over here, and there should be some nice areas where you're in the shadow and you're shooting out to a bright day. You're having a very massive range of exposures, lots of stops. When you're talking about exposure, you call it a stop, and there'll probably be about 8 stops difference in detail between the dark inside those woods and the light of the sunshine outside. And working with bracketing, you can move through those exposures and collect detail in each of them, because a lot of cameras won't collect that detail within one exposure. So by a number of exposures, you'll get a good exposure for outside, you'll get an average exposure for both, you'll get a good exposure for inside. So that's your bracketing. There'll be one that works best, but then also we could use those 3 exposures, layer them on top of each other and paint through detail on each one, so get more detail than you could out of a simple exposure from the camera. So we're going to head in there now. I'm going to talk you through the problem, I'm going to show you the solution as well, and then later on we're going to go into Photoshop and I'm going to show you how to use Photoshop to blend those different exposures. Okay, so now we're amongst those trees that I pointed to, and this area really sort of illustrates the problem that bracketing is a solution to. So as you can see by this video exposure, it's exposed okay for me, perhaps a little bit dark, but then if you look at the really bright area over there, the sky, the cinema, the grass that's got all that direct sunlight hitting it, it's incredibly bright, there's no detail there. Whereas if we look, as it slowly gets down here, the exposure is much brighter, and then if we get down here, it's darker. So what bracketing can do, you can use bracketing to create lots of exposures of this view, and there might be one that does a reasonable job of all of it, or we can create 5 different exposures of this view, and then on the computer we can use Photoshop to take the detail, the bright sky from this one, and blend it with the shadow area here and just get the most of this view and capture more detail than the camera actually can. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you in the camera how we can move between exposures. So you'll see a light, a dark, a mid exposure, and you'll see that different types of details being picked up at those different exposures. So I'll keep filming, and I'm at the camera now. So this is the average exposure. It did an okay job on me, perhaps a tiny bit dark, but the background is really bright. So if I now change my shutter speed to an 800th of a second, this is video, so it doesn't quite tie up with photography settings, but you can see here, this is an exposure that gets good detail in the sky and the distant wall of that cinema that's getting hit directly by the sun. And then we would move down to an exposure of 200th, and we're starting to get okay detail in the foreground. It's maybe still a little bit dark, but you can see now we're starting to lose that detail in the background. And then we can go right down to an 80th of a second, and we're starting to see detail in the trees to the left, but everything else is getting so bleached out. And then maybe we move to one other stop darker to a 30th, and now we've got lovely details in the tree, but you can see that
this area here is absolutely bleached out, really bright. So yeah, that's basically shows you how within different exposures you can capture different levels of detail. So if you're just bracketing to as a sort of safe bet, you can then choose whichever of those 5 exposures you like the most, but you can also use those 5 exposures and grab different bits of those, and it's kind of called high dynamic range photography, and we'll look at that in Photoshop in a second. So I'm now going to capture those bracketed exposures in still photography. I'm going to talk you through the settings. So the first thing I do is try and find an average exposure. Let's have a look at that. So I've got that at 400th of a second, f4 at ISO 200. So, and that, I'm looking at the detail, I've got reasonable detail in the grass in the middle of the shot. I'd say the sky's too bright and the trees in the foreground are too dark. So this is where bracketing comes in useful. If I now do a darker exposure, so I move from a 400th of a second to a 1000th of a second and take a picture, and we have a look at that, you can see we're starting to get that detail in the distance. And then if I go even darker still, so to 2000th of a second, and we have a look at that, then you can see there's loads of detail in the sky. Sometimes it's okay to go too far, to expose too dark, because you don't have to use all the photographs you take. But yeah, now I'm going to go right back down to 400 for my middle exposure, and then start going lighter from there. So I'm going to go to a 200th of a second and take a picture, and we'll have a look at that. And that's starting to get really bright. It's really bleached out on the cinema, but the trees in the foreground are starting to look okay. And then if I go a tiny bit brighter still, so down to an 80th of a second at f4 and take a picture, and let's have a look at that. And it's incredibly bright on the actual cinema and the car park and where the sun falls, but in the shadow area we're suddenly starting to get detail and shape, and that'll be really useful. So I'm going to go back to my computer now, and we're going to show you in Photoshop how I put these elements together, how I use layer masks, which I've talked about in a previous demo, the one Invisible People. So if you want to learn a bit about layer masks, go and have a look at that demo, because there's a breakdown of how to use layer masks there. But I'm going to basically use layer masks to paint through different bits of detail from those 5 exposures to get the best image. So we've got that detail up right from where the sun falls to the shadow area, and we can get a really nice image that almost feels like a painting. You don't feel like you've got these deep dark areas with no detail at all.
Okay, so we're back at the computer now, and I'm going to show you how to blend those 5 different exposures. So I've opened them into Photoshop already, and I'm going to first of all just take a look at them and see what we've got. So I'm going to make them smaller using the zoom tool. There's our middle exposure, there's our lightest exposure, there's our light exposure, and there's our darkest. I'm going to just put them in order. So we've got the middle one, the first picture we took, the darker one, darkest, light, lightest. So that's all 5 images in the order we took them. Middle, dark, darkest, light, lightest. Now you can see different amounts of detail is coming through on all 5 of the images. If we go towards the darkest, we're seeing that sky detail. If we go towards the lightest, we're seeing that detail in the trees in the foreground. So we're going to blend them together, so different bits of those details from each of the exposures is all in one photograph, so we can bring in that sky, bring in the detail there. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So if we go to dark, I'm going to go then to select menu, all, and the edit menu, copy, and we can close that because it's remembered it to the computer. And then if we go paste, now we've got 2 layers. We've got the middle layer, which is the middle exposure, and then we've got the dark layer on top. So our layer palette is slowly growing. I'm going to start by labeling these up. I'll call the first one middle, and I'll call the second one dark, and then we can bring in the darkest layer. So click on that, select all, and then edit, copy, and we can close it, and then edit, paste, and now we've got our darkest layer. So quickly label up that layer, and now we're going to go to the light layers. So there's on the light, copy, so copy and close that, and then edit, paste, and our layer palette is getting bigger still. And then this last one I'm going to do slightly different. I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts. Whenever I can, I use keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop because it makes things so much quicker. You don't have to go into the menus for everything. You can be much more kind of intuitive, which is really handy. So keyboard shortcuts to get this in is Command A, selects all, and then Command C copies it all, and we can close it. And then we're on middle. If we go Command V, it drops it on top, and I'll label that up. Okay, so that's great. We've now got our 5 layers in one image, and the layer palette is bigger. So I can make our image a little bit bigger so we can examine it now. So the layer palette is almost like a stack of paper. That's the best way of thinking about it. I've done a tutorial as well on how to create an invisible person, and in that I'm going into slightly more detail on how to use the layer palette. So if you want to really dive into the layer palette, have a look at that tutorial, because I go into slightly more detail than I'm going to now. But the important thing to understand with the layer palette is it's like a stack of paper. So let me just show you. It's like a stack of paper, and whichever layer is near the bottom of the layer palette, near the bottom of your computer screen, is a piece of paper that sits underneath all the others. So all the others sit on top of that layer and obscure it. So you can see dark sits on top of the middle layer, darkest sits on top of the dark layer in the middle layer, and so on. So that's how the layer palette works. I'm going to show you how layer masks works. So I'm going to click on dark, and at the bottom of the layer palette there's a grayed out box with a black circle in. If I click on that, we get a layer mask, which is this pure white box, which is next to our dark layer. You've got the dark image and then this pure white box. Currently, it's a pure white layer mask, and that's me telling Photoshop to show everything in that image. The layer mask is 100% white, and that's me telling Photoshop to show all of that detail, 100% of it. If I now get a black brush, so I'm going to go to the brush tool in the toolbar and make sure it's black, I can eat a hole in that layer mask. So I can do that, and I can paint through. If you look at the layer mask now, it's got a big black area. I can paint through to the layer underneath. So that's really useful. That's how layer masks work, and it's really handy. So I'm going to bin that, and I'm going to show you how we're going to use them in this tutorial. So we're on the dark layer. If we go down to the layer mask at the bottom of the layer palette again, and if we hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and click on that, we get something slightly different. We get a layer mask, but now that layer mask is 100% black, which is me telling Photoshop to make everything in that layer invisible, so you can't see any of it at all. But now if I get a brush, if I make that brush quite big, so let's make it about that's probably a bit big, about 3000, and then if we make sure we've got a black brush and we put the opacity down to about 40, then I can, as long as I'm on the layer mask, so if we look at that dark layer, as long as I'm clicked on the layer mask, the brackets around that and not around the image, then it's that I'm editing, and I can just gently, if I get a white brush, just by using that at quite a low opacity, just bring in a little bit of that detail from the sky. Not too much. This is all about being subtle. It's not about making any sharp edged selections. I've got a really big brush. It's really soft. It's just about suggesting that sky, kind of bringing in that detail in a really subtle, kind of natural way. So there you go. If I turn that off, you can see I've just subtly brought in that sky. I'm now going to work on the darkest layer and bring in some detail from that. So I'm clicking on the darkest layer. I'm going to create a layer mask at the bottom of the layer palette, holding down Alt. It's totally concealed that layer. But then I know if I move right in here at the cinema, that wall is being hit directly by the sunlight, so you can't really see any of the tiles. So if I'm clicked on the layer mask on the darkest layer, and I can make that brush a lot smaller. So let's make it, yeah, that's probably about right. And then I put my opacity down to about 30. I can then just slowly paint through a bit of detail of that wall. So it's not bleached out, it's not pure white. You can just see a little bit of that detail coming through. And that's probably all I need from that darkest exposure. But you do have to be careful. Sometimes when you're working in this way, you can bring in too much detail and it can look a bit unnatural. I think I've maybe brought a bit too much of that detail in from the darkest layer. But what's useful is you can hit the eye on that layer and see what effect it's having. And it just looks a bit smudged and a bit false. But you can change the opacity of that layer. So if I put that layer down to about 50% and now see what it looks like, it's just suggesting it. It's very subtle and it looks much better now. So you can use that almost as a fader. You can make a move, you can alter your layer mask, bring through a bit of detail and then fade it in and out till it looks about right, till it looks natural, till it looks how that view looked to your eyes. Okay, now we're going to bring some detail through from the lighter layers. So clicking on the light layer, making a layer mask and holding down Alt to conceal it. And now if I get a brush, I'm going to make it big again, up in the thousands, maybe 2000. Yeah, that'll do. And now let's get my opacity up to 40. You can do the opacity by going up to the box here and type in a number. So you can go 36, but there's a really good keyboard shortcut, which is just press a number. So if you want to go to 90, press 9. If you want to go to 30, press 3. I'm going to go for 40 to start with and see how I get on. So if I slowly click on this heavy shadow area where the trees are, you can see I'm starting to bring a bit of texture, a bit of detail, a bit of shape, and the grass is maybe a bit dark. So I'm going to hit 1, so I'm 10% opacity on that brush, and just line it up a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. It's now looking like quite a rounded exposure, but I'm going to use a little bit of this lightest layer just to bring in some detail in those really heavy shadows. So open that layer, Alt on the layer mask, and then I'm going to zoom right in and get myself a brush from up here. I'm going to make that brush smaller, so let's make it about 200, and then I can just bring in some details in the heaviest of the shadows. And then up here I know there's some heavy shadows as well. Sometimes you don't want to bring in too much, but it just makes a slightly more complete image, brings in a little bit too much. Maybe I've gone a bit too far from that on that one, so I'll just put my opacity down on that layer a little bit so it's not quite as bright, it's not bringing in quite as much detail. So yeah, that's how you blend the exposure. If I turn the layers off and we work our way back down to the middle layer, the average exposure, you can see we've got all that burnt out detail and not much detail in the shadows. But then if I turn those on, we've got a much more rounded exposure where there's detail everywhere. Now the last thing to think about is saving that image. So if I go to File, Save As, if I save it as a TIFF or a Photoshop document or a large document format, as long as I've got the layer box ticked, so let's call it car park layers, and then save it. And as long as I had that layer box clicked, all that information in the layer palette is remembered. So we've got the layers stacked on top of each other, the layer masks. So you can save it like that and go back in. You can make a much more tidy selection of the layer masks further down the line. So like here, I've done it quite quick because it's a demo. I could go in and make a much more detailed, careful selection. As long as I save it in layers, then I can do that. I can always go back to it, which is really handy. But if you're wanting to put it on the internet or print it, it's good to have it flattened so you haven't got all these layers and you haven't got massive files. So if you go to these 4 lines in the top right of the layer palette, you get a drop down menu. If you go to flatten image and click that, all of those 5 layers, all of those layer masks just become one flat layer, as though it's just one photograph that happened to pick up this detail that I've managed to pull out by blending 5 photographs. And then you can save it as a TIFF again, or a JPEG. You can just get it ready to go. And that's it really, that's the process. You blend the files by putting them on top of each other, you blend all the different exposures and bring through the detail you want. A couple more things I want to mention. It's quite similar, I mean this is a process called HDR, which I mentioned earlier, which stands for High Dynamic Range, and it has detail from lots of exposures that it puts together. A lot of cameras have that as an automatic setting, or software has it where you can automatically apply a high dynamic range treatment and it will blend exposures automatically. I tend to, again, like doing it myself. I find if I allow the computer to do it, you get some really strange effects. You get odd halos around the trees. You get just, it looks a bit smudged and a bit kind of rubbed and like odd. It just looks odd. But doing it this way, with big brushes, just suggesting the different levels of brightness, keeps everything much more kind of gentle and suggested and subtle, which, you know, hopefully then people don't notice, and hopefully it mimics what it is to look at a view. It's not too fierce. It's not using those exposures in too fierce a way. It's using them as your eyes would pass over a view if you were stood there. That's what I'm always aiming at. I'm always thinking, what did that view actually look like? How did it look as I moved my eyes around and they adjusted to the shadow area and the highlight area? And that's always what I'm aiming at. I try not to go further than that. And one last thing I wanted to mention is some cameras do have a bracket setting, so you can make it bracket automatically. You can set it to do 3 exposures, so a mid, a dark, a light, or 5 exposures, or you can also set how much those exposures move, how much darker or how much lighter they go for each exposure. I don't tend to use that. I tend to do this manually because I want to know what my camera's doing. I want to have a lot of input. I want it to be quite intuitive. So I always bracket manually just by moving through the shutter speed myself. But I know a lot of photographers that use the auto bracketing or the camera's bracketing system. So that's handy as well. Just see what suits you. So that's it. That's a tutorial looking at bracketing exposures, why that can be useful. I'm working on a new tutorial which is all going to be about the direction of light and how the direction that light hits an object or landscape can define it in different ways, and what to think about when you're photographing with light. So I hope that one will be useful. That'll be following in a week or so. If anyone's got any suggestions of subjects they'd like me to cover, please get in touch. And thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.